Okay, yes, it's recording. Perfect. So hopefully I can get this out of here. We're going to do introductions next. Oh, very quickly, these are the slides that we're using today. So if you have a device and you want to follow along, I'll give you a second to use this tiny URL address, or you can write it down and have it for access later. And I'm just trying to figure out how I can get this to go. There we go. Okay. I do, yeah. And the next slide is introduction. So, do you want to start and introduce yourself while people get
just my background. So one thing that I think Courtney and I are unique that we bring is that we're both practitioners and researchers. My background is that in education, I started teaching in a special ed program that focused on students with emotional behavior disorders. I always joke about how I was hired, but I think it says a lot. During my interview for that job, prior to that, I was a ranger in the military, and in my interview, after a master's program of getting my special ed cert, my master's in special ed, focusing on behavior disorders, in my interview, they didn't ask me what my theory of ed was. They didn't ask me, what type of interventions I wanted to work on. They just saw that I was a ranger. Like, oh, okay, you can handle this.
Oh, okay.
And immediately I was thinking, like, what the heck am I getting into? So in that program, we were averaging about 20 restraints a week. And these are young adults from age like 15 to about 21. So immediately we brought in mental health services, we brought in counseling, we brought in, we aligned with probation officers, we brought in King County's our anger replacement training program. We tried to do multiple interventions. We did service learning projects. And once we got those things up and going, restraints went down to about 1 every other week. And that spoke volumes to me. One, we weren't providing services for these kids. They were dying for these services. Once we put those services in place, oh my gosh, behavior started to change. Confidence, self-esteem changed, confidence changed. And so from that moment I went on, I was told you need to go become a school leader, go become a principal. So I went back to grad school, met Courtney, who's my wife, and we were in the principal training program called Danforth. From there, I went on to work with Meade Middle School, which in Seattle had about 80% poverty rate. Disproportionality was 3 African-American male suspensions to 1 Caucasian male suspension. I was brought in under the Nestlin grant, which was to actually reduce that. Again, we aligned, instead of disciplining, kicking kids out, we used restorative practices. We set up behavioral interventions with David Lewis. David Lewis was also brought in on the same grant. From there, we reduced the disproportionality to 1.6 to 1 within 2 years. After that, I realized I need to go back to grad school. So I started studying psychology and working towards my PhD at Psych. And I started working with Clay Cook. Started to understand the MTSS model much more. Started digging deeper into ACE study. Understanding how behavior develops and how we can actually prune and modify behavior. We can add the plasticity of the brain, which I learned a lot about. And so now we're doing this.
So did everyone get the tiny URL address? Okay, excellent. And we've got a few more people coming in. Hopefully this will click now. What's happening? So my name is Courtney Dykos, and I started my career as an elementary teacher in Chicago. I don't know why my clicker's not working, but here, I'll let you guys see if you can figure it out. It's plugged in down below. And I have always served high-needs, low-income schools. I moved to Seattle in 2014, and I worked as Reading First coach in West Seattle. Many of you may remember Reading First. It was a federal initiative. Good morning and welcome. Come on in. There's seats up front if you guys want to come find a seat. And as Chris stated, 11 years ago, we met in the Danforth program at the University of Washington, where we got our principal certification, and from there, for 9 years, I served as an administrator in Highline Public Schools, which, if you're familiar with Highline, it's just south of Seattle, very diverse, very ethnically and linguistically diverse, and I served there as a central ops administrator, and then I was a high school assistant principal and an elementary principal. principal. And again, significantly high needs populations. As a principal, I really saw how our staff was struggling with kids who had been exposed to toxic stress and how we could better serve them with a more comprehensive model. And so we started studying the growth mindset work and started understanding the impact of trauma on kids and really thinking about things like how are we teaching social and emotional learning? How are we helping kids learn from their mistakes in a more restorative way rather than using suspension, which we know, even though sometimes it has to be used, doesn't really work to change behavior from kids. And so fortunately, at the same time, Chris was working on his PhD and learning a lot about research that I needed to use with my own staff and students. So that kind of brought about a passion for this work. And now we're full-time consulting, supporting schools here in Snohomish County, which has been really exciting to get started with Cascade and Mountain Way and other schools that you'll hear about this morning. And we're also working with other schools in Washington and a few districts outside of the state as well. So really excited about the opportunity for more schools to join the project. I think the opportunity we have in Snohomish County to impact a whole generation of kids is really profound. So nice to meet you and thank you for being here.
My name is Vincent. I'm really excited to be part of this project. So when I think about 20 schools in one county and what will be 10 years from now as a result of this work, very exciting. My background is in experiential education. I've worked with the Association of Washington School Principals, most recently in their student leadership arm. And Lasima is founder and director of that bilingual leadership camp, but she's for middle school students outreach. This recent DACA realities is hit really hard. I worked with hundreds of undocumented students across the state. And that kind of is what put me into a trauma-informed study at Portland State University. There's a certificate you can get. It's kind of a cool little deal there. But that really thrust me in and led me into what is multi-tiered systems of support and putting my eggs in this basket, basically what it comes down to. So I really believe in what it is. I think it systematizes empathy. It's kind of a funny thing to say, right? Systematizing empathy. But I think it takes away the punitive hammer, especially for the disproportionality of discipline, and brings in solutions that work for kids and families.
We just welcomed a few more folks, so if you don't mind, those that just came in, will you just tell us quickly who you are and where you work, please?
Sure. I'm Becky Brockman. I'm the Executive Director of Special Services with the Snohomish Schools.
Excellent, thank you. Your Snohomish district is represented very well this morning. Yeah. Congratulations. Thank you very much for being here.
And I'm Vicki Berard, Principal of Frank Wagner Elementary in the Rose School District.
Excellent. Good morning. Thank you for being here.
And I'm Joanna Dittmore, School Counselor at Frank Wagner.
Okay, awesome. Thank you very much for joining us. So is it working now? It looks like you want to go the opposite direction.
Opposite direction.
Yeah, you want to go down.
Counterintuitive.
Yep, it is counterintuitive. Okay, so we will click through those for us. So we're going to do a little bit of teaching about trauma. We're going to actually watch a video of our colleague David Lewis, who if you are participating with us, you'll get to know. And just a 5-minute video, just to give some baseline information. I think probably everyone in this room has been exposed to understanding of toxic stress, but we just want to have some common understanding, and then specifically how that informs our what we call the T-MTSS model, so the multi-tiered systems of support model informed by trauma. We'll talk to you more about what that is. And then get a little bit into the specifics of what to anticipate if you participate with us for the 2-year model, so how does that look? And then we are very fortunate to have Kathy from Everett High School and Cheryl from Mountain Way Elementary School from Granite Falls. And so these are 2 principals that we're working closely with already in Cohort 1 who can tell you more about what the experience has been so far for them and their staff. And ideally we'll stick to this agenda, but we're already a little off, so this is what we're trying to do. All right, so hopefully
this is out of Seattle Schools. They put some videos together, and David Lewis, who's a colleague of ours, is going to explain a quick kind of like 6-minute summary of T-MTSS cases. Or actually more like cases.
I think it may be on, can you go to the...
Have to go to the first.
Yeah. There we go.
One of the main counters and protective factors.
This is in a series, so he refers to a previous video.
So we've just viewed the video with Willard Timerson and him talking about the power of a relationship. And what we know is that a positive, trusting relationship is one of the main counters and protective factors for childhood trauma. And when we talk about trauma, There's simple trauma and complex trauma. And from my own experience of being in a car collision, I remember my brain and body preparing me for a collision for the next 3 months. But after 3 months of being safe, I went back to a normal baseline. That's different than a child who's experiencing adverse childhood experiences or complex trauma. It's as if they're in small collisions all the time, and their body and brain won't go back to a neutral state, which impacts their school experience day to day. But what is complex trauma? A traumatic event or trauma is an experience that causes physical, emotional, psychological distress or harm. That's different than an ACE or an adverse childhood experience. An adverse childhood experiences are ongoing experiences in a child's life before the age of 18 that have the ability to impact them into adulthood. And the impact of having too many ACEs or adverse childhood experiences can be long-term effects on brain development and physical development, as well as move a child from a state of trust to mistrust and hope to despair. So what defines an ACE or an adverse childhood experience? Well, these are the 10 categories that are measured. Physical abuse, sexual abuse, verbal or emotional abuse, physical neglect, emotional neglect, depressed or mentally ill family member, caregiver in prison or incarcerated, caregiver addicted to alcohol or other substance, witnessing abuse in the home, or a loss of a parent for any reason. This is what we know. The effects of ACEs and toxic stress are physiologically damaging, but we also know that the effects are reversible. The earlier that we address them, the better. Stress is the body's normal response to challenging events or environments. While positive stress is just a part of growing up, toxic stress is when the body and brain of a child is overloaded with too many stress hormones, specifically adrenaline and cortisol. And toxic stress harms the functions and structures of the brain and the body. Causes of toxic stress are generations of inadequate parenting, multiple changes in caregivers, unemployment of a family member, the experience of racism. As you look at this list, consider which ones of these are your students impacted by. You have just taken some time to consider some causes of toxic stress. And as a result, what you may see are behaviors associated with an imbalance in the development of brain regions. And the three main brain regions typically spoken about are the hippocampus, which is associated with memory, the amygdala, which is associated with emotions and instinct, and then the prefrontal cortex, which gives us our ability to think things out and slow down and regulate our emotions. So for example, you may see a student who gets triggered by an event in their hippocampus, instinctively put in a position to react by their amygdala, and have an underdeveloped prefrontal cortex that does not allow them to regulate that emotion or that behavior that follows. So how do we help those kids? We know that the impacts are real, but we also know that the impacts are reversible. We can help them by building a trauma-informed educational environment. And a trauma-informed school environment consists of adults that know how to respond, that have awareness, that have knowledge, skills, and can create an overall school climate that's consistent, predictable, with structure, to where students know what's coming next throughout their school day. And where the adults can ask the question of what happened to you, as opposed to what's wrong with you. And when we talk about awareness and knowledge, what we're talking about is adults understanding the prevalence that adverse childhood experiences and trauma have on our students, families, and the overall community. A trauma-informed school incorporates specific strategies and practices across each level of the organization that are grounded in consistency, predictability, and structure that gets anxiety levels down and puts a student in the part of their brain that allows them to access good academic learning. And what we're describing is a positive school climate where all students feel a sense of safety, belonging, and acceptance throughout their school day. And the good news is a trauma-informed educational environment is great for all kids. Now, here are a few questions for you to reflect upon.
So any responses or questions, thoughts when you just listen to that video?
I like the analogy used of, this car accident and how, it just helps explain it really in simple terms. And how what happens to our brain and how we can get over like a more simple trauma, a more complex trauma.
When we teach more in depth, Chris often talks about the fact that the APA still defines trauma as just a one-time event. Whereas what we know from this research is that it's this ongoing exposure to toxic stress that really has the damaging effects, especially on developing brains.
Right. Sustained toxic stress is what we'll be getting into.
Yeah. Yeah. So we want to talk a bit about our model that we're using, the framework that we're providing to schools. And I'm going to invite both of you guys to help me present on this. But I'm assuming everyone in the room has been exposed in the past to the RTI triangle, the PBIS triangle, maybe even the MTSS triangle. Anyone unfamiliar with that?
Are those acronyms sound familiar? It's because it's not an acronym, so you always have to double check.
Yeah.
And so what we're looking at is essentially something that came out of the public health model. So the public health model would be three-tiered system, universal, specialized, and individualized, which is often used within education within RTI. And I'm assuming everybody here knows not to smoke. Have you heard about this? Smoking's bad for you? Did you? Okay. Think about how you heard that the first time. Somebody give me an example. How did you hear smoking's bad for you the first time? Was it C.H. Coop with his funky beard coming out making a speech? Was it a billboard that you saw? Was it an advertisement that you saw? Was it your health class where your teachers are actually teaching you that smoking is bad for you? If that's it, that was a tier 1 intervention. If that worked for you, you didn't go smoke, that worked for you. And that worked for about 80% of the country. The new cohort coming up, the younger generation coming up to learn that smoking is bad for you. Now, if that didn't work for you, if that didn't work for me, what would I do? If I wanted to quit smoking and I started smoking for a little bit, what would I do? Go on, class.
Get a patch.
Get a patch, thank you.
Nicotine gum.
Get Nicorette, right. So go to the drugstore, right? So go to the drugstore, something accessible in my community, something that is specialized for me because I'm a smoker. And so I'm able to access this tier 2 intervention because it specializes for smokers. And it doesn't need a prescription. It doesn't need all the, I can go see a doctor, I can access it. So the tier 2 intervention for smoking is the patch and Nicorette. What would a tier 3 be? Anybody can think of that? A tier 3 intervention for someone who's trying to quit smoking? Hypnosis. Thank you. Actually, the most effective tier 3 intervention is hypnosis on smoking. Or I could go get specialized medicine. I can get into deep psychoanalysis on why is this smoking? Why do I need that oral fixation? Why do I need to always smoke? So figuring something out like that could be my tier 3 intervention. And essentially, that's what we're talking about. It's nothing new. We didn't reinvent the wheel. I'm sure educators have seen several triangles in their careers. And so what we've basically done is the public health model became basically RTI. Then PBIS came out. PBIS came along, and they started using a tier 1 intervention on extrinsic reinforcement, common language, common expectations, database decision making, and that is essentially what PBIS is. So we include PBIS also as a tier 1 approach for everything, but before that, we also emphasize that cultural responsive pedagogy needs to be part of practice, and we need to understand neurology. As educators, we're focusing on the brain, and for some absurd reason, we never studied neurology in our teacher prep programs or pre-service education programs. And so we need to make sure that we are up on the latest research on what we're essentially saying trauma-informed practice, but really what is it? Understanding neurology and behavior. That's all that is.
Do you want to add anything?
Only that in the gray, those 2 anchor points are really the soil that everything's built on top of.
Right.
What we often hear is that even for schools that have done PBIS for 3 or 4 years, they say, wow, we're getting good at how to do this, but now we know why. And being rooted in those foundational approaches give us the why that that everything is built upon.
Can I see the pointer? Do you mind? So the other thing, Vincent designed this graphic for us, which I'm really proud of. But a couple of other things that we'll talk more about in terms of the specifics of if you're involved in this 2-year project with us is that fundamentally all of your staff really understanding both of these pieces as the foundation for this work helps us lead to the fidelity of implementation. What we know is that we can address 80% of students' needs, but that means that in Tier 1 we're consistently using the same Tier 1 approaches. And what we often find by visiting schools, especially schools that have been trying to take on things like PBIS, is that there are great examples of that work happening in pockets, but it isn't always necessarily universally being applied. And so part of what we do in working with staff is help them understand the why. Well, why should I be standing at the door to greet students every period? Why should I always have a scheduled posting? These are things that are not challenging to do, but for a teacher that's taught the same way for decades and has their practice down and in their mind, this works for my kids, we help them and the school together identify, well, but when that kid leaves your class and goes to another class, we're asking them to code switch. And that's a huge amount of cognitive load for kids, especially who've been exposed to toxic stress. So let's create a universal environment where everyone knows what to expect. It's actually going to reduce anxiety not only for kids, but also for adults. The other big piece that we want to talk about is that if you get involved, then you'll have what we're calling a trauma-informed leadership team for Tier 1, but we want to use the data of your students in your school to drive which interventions are going to work the best for your setting. And so that regular practice of setting up interventions and then having the right data to progress monitor is a big part of our support to you. That's actually that's the biggest support we give to the schools is on a monthly basis meeting with that team and really thinking strategically about what's going to help your school with this implementation.
One of the best things we can do is be predictable places, right? In children's unpredictable lives, if the institution can we know how behavior is going to be handled. I've expected it's been very clearly lined out for me. So the other piece is that I really believe this gives local control. I happen to be sitting in a meeting with Chris for a school in Seattle that serves on a university campus, at-risk youth, I'll just put that in quotes. But that they were really struggling. They're saying, all of our kids are coming to school high. Like with a reek of marijuana, everybody knows it's part of what's happening. And so really thinking, what do our kids need that everyone under the sun is going to get in our institution? And in that case, it's drug and alcohol prevention education that every student needs. And so that's a decision that the local building can make about how do we respond to our kids.
So another component that when we talk about Tier 1, and part of what we do, and Kathy and Cheryl can speak to this, but as we get started working in your school, we're looking at how do all of the pieces of this pie fit together for Tier 1. So how are kids learning about their social and emotional needs? Is that a lesson that comes from the counselor once a month? Is that something that only happens at certain grade levels? Or are there some universal lessons that are being applied across the building and universal themes around things like empathy that we're thinking about as a school?
Is it being integrated within the community for the week? Is it being integrated within lesson plans as well?
With PBIS, as most of you probably know, what we really mean by this is, are there common and positive expectations for kids that all kids know? How do we walk in the hallway? How do we participate in the playground? What does it look like in the classroom? PBIS helps schools define this really well and set up those common expectations as well as those common reinforcers. So part of what we'll do is take some measurement for ourselves. If we go in a dozen classrooms, is there evidence of that PBIS happening in every classroom? Do kids know what to expect in every classroom? Do they know what to expect in the hallway? We know, as David talked a little bit in the video, about how kids that have been exposed to toxic stress are often not engaging the prefrontal cortex. It's underdeveloped because they're in this loop of fight or flight on a regular basis. And so supporting kids' ability to recognize their own physiological and emotional states and think about how am I going to calm myself. We know that if universally we all take a deep breath or we all do some stretching together, that it's going to help all of us reduce anxiety, and especially the kids that are struggling. And so how do these practices look? It's part of what we support schools in thinking about. Restorative practice, identifying when kids make a mistake, how are they going to repair that versus how are they going to be punished. I think a lot of us in education have been moving in this direction. And so at both Kathy and Cheryl's schools, when we trained this past week and last week, we went deeper around, well, what are we currently doing? Let's take stock of these practices and let's identify practices we want to go deeper around.
And not restorative justice. Restorative justice, you may hear the difference between restorative practice and restorative justice. Restorative justice is a juvenile justice approach. Some people are trying to push it into schools. We're saying, everything we do, we want to make sure it's research-based and evidence-based. Restorative practices are. The restorative justice model is not. And I'm sorry, I hope I'm not confusing, but I want to make sure it's clear language in what we're talking about.
And Chris is emphasizing that with everything that we do in supporting schools, we want to show that it's evidence and research-based. I think too often...
It not just feels good.
Right, and a lot of us are guilty in education of the next new shiny thing that sounds like it's going to be a quick fix, and we don't always have the time in education to do our research and homework ourselves to say, wait a second, do we know if this actually works? And so that's part of the benefit of partnering with us, is that we're working behind the scenes to continue to be involved in the research and to help your staff understand this is what we know from the research about this particular practice. And so as Vincent and Chris described, the foundational understanding of trauma, as well as really reflecting on how is the institution responding to all cultures and all kids. This is another thing we look at when we come and first observe, as well as once we're doing implementation checks with you and your leadership team, is if I'm a Muslim student sitting in your classroom, do I feel safe? Do I feel like my culture is being validated? And that might be because of a picture on the wall, it might be because of a reference to Ramadan, it might be something else, but how do I as a student experience that when the reality is that most of our teaching staffs look like this room, where the majority of us are white. We know we're not going to change that necessarily, although supporting you in your hiring practices is something we can definitely do. But thinking critically about what is the experience of kids to know that they identify and feel safe is a huge focus of the work. And as we'll talk about, getting data from kids about their sense of belonging will also be a focus because they know best what they're experiencing, and we can use that information to drive more interventions. And we talked about universal screening and data a little bit, but we will be engaging you in thinking about your whole school and how are you screening those kids.
Getting baseline assessments, so something such as like the SIBs or the SEBs, student internalized behavior screeners, student externalized behavior screeners. We want to make sure that you have a baseline understanding of where students are within your school. And ideally that measure occurs 3 times a year so that we can see, is there growth? That also informs us about our Tier 1. How's our Tier 1 doing?
And all of this is in service of students' access to rigorous and differentiated core content. Because we know that if students are not regulated, if they don't feel like they belong, if they're managing their anxiety every time they transition between classes, then they're not in their brain ready to receive the instruction and the great teaching that you and your teachers are doing. Any questions about this piece? Can I quickly through it?
A lot of info.
It's thorough.
Thank you.
So I'm watching the clock, and I'm just going to keep moving us forward. But Vincent mentioned this earlier. Around Tier 1 especially, when it's predictable, it's preventable. And so getting that message across and really understanding in your school community, what currently can you predict is going to happen with kids? Well, if we know that, then how do we get ahead of that? How can we be preventable around those issues? I'm going to skip through these slides. Do you want to talk about ACEs?
Essentially what we're talking, so what a lot of what ACEs comes from is the fact that students aren't getting their basic Maslow needs met. So a lot of disruptive behaviors that we see in school is because nurturing hasn't been met. And that can be unintentional neglect. That nurturing wasn't fulfilled because mom and dad are working 2 or 3 jobs. And I only get to see mom and dad for an hour. And I have 3 or 4 siblings. So what am I going to do when mom and dad shows up? I'm going to make sure they see me. I'm going to be loud. I'm going to make sure that I'm able to get their attention, make sure that I'm being present, make sure that I'm fulfilling that Maslow need. It's not that I'm being selfish. I have a basic Maslow need that needs to be filled. And so when a lot of those kids come to school, what does that look like in your classroom? They're going to still seek that Maslow need. They're going to still seek that nurturing. If they don't understand how to do that in a school classroom appropriate way, it's going to look disruptive. All of a sudden, we start going down the cycle of Johnny getting referred to the office for disruptive behavior, even though it's not malintended. It's just trying to get that Maslow need met. And so having that understanding of, from the perspective of why is this kid doing that versus I can't believe this kid's doing it, it's annoying the hell out of me right now and you need to go to the office. So we want to make sure that educators understand that these are basic needs that we all need. And so often when these are in a deficit, it's going to create a maladaptive neurological pathway in behavior. Does that make sense? Questions?
We're going to keep going.
So from the A study, what we found out from the A study is that what ends up happening is that, as I was just mentioning, it's disrupted neurological development occurring. And so from that, it's impairing their social, emotional, cognitive. So again, mom and dad are working 2 or 3 jobs just to keep a roof over our head and food on the tables. And it's disrupting my neurological development because of socioeconomic inequality. And then I'm not doing it healthy, so it looks maladaptive. And so now I'm going to engage in disruptive bad behaviors, which eventually can lead towards the results of that study, basically suggesting early death. And I'm not saying that just because of nurturing, but what we do know is that negative behaviors are developed because those Maslow needs are being met. I'm seeking, because I didn't get nurturing, I'm going to seek it through drug abuse. Because I didn't get nurturing, I'm going to seek it through promiscuous behavior. And so what we know is that the end result of ACEs, when the scores are high, is it's early death.
Well, we want to get ahead of that, support kids.
Yeah.
We all have the opportunity.
Heavy stuff, but it's reality.
Okay.
And so, go ahead.
I was just going to say that with all the age groups that you serve, whether they're elementary or high school, we know that the prefrontal cortex finishes developing at age 25. And so the brain has plasticity, which is the main message here, and we know that through evidence-based interventions, many of which happen at the tier 1 level, so literally being predictable and consistent is going to help students reduce anxiety and help us teach them new neurological pathways for their behaviors. And then once tier 1 is established, we can focus on students that have some more intensive needs at the tier 2 or tier 3 level. And so we'll talk a little later about the overall model, but what I want to communicate to you is that in partnering with the county for a 2-year project, our goal is to get your tier 1 really strong and then shift gears and focus on tiers 2 and 3. Having been a principal myself, I know what it's like to feel like, oh my gosh, my tier 3 kids, I just want to focus on my tier 3 kids because they're the ones that are constantly in the office and constantly having issues. And while we will be supportive to you with those kids, we also know that if we clean up tier 1, you're going to see a lot less of those kids. And so for some schools, both Kathy and Cheryl's schools, for example, they've been doing a lot of tier 1 work already, and so their readiness as a school to take on tier 1 might be sooner than another school where we spend a lot of time still establishing what tier 1 is. And so our model in supporting schools is very constructivist and school-centered, which means that not every school is going to need the same thing, and not every school is going to move at the same rate. Okay.
So just real quick on this, just illustrating the idea of what behavior is. This is a neurological pathway. It's not a Jackson Pollock painting. And what we're looking at is the myelin sheath development. So I always give the example. How many of you have driven home from work and don't even remember driving home? We've all done that, right? And you're thinking like, oh my God, I didn't run over anybody. My car is not banged up. Like there's not a stop sign dragging behind the car. So somehow I did this. Well, within that process, you were able to get the turn signal turn. Gently apply your foot to the brake. Gently apply your foot to the gas. Make it turn. That doesn't look like you're on the speedway. And so all of a sudden, you're doing this because you have this myelin sheath developed. It's just natural. It just happens automatic. You don't have to think about it. Well, our kids who are looking for that nurturing or other Maslow needs they're seeking, the behavior they've adopted in that sustained, toxic, stressful environment build this myelin sheath to where it's just automatic. So if I need nurturing, well, that means I need to make sure I'm seen and disruptive, right? Versus teaching the kiddo, all right, we're going to develop a new dendrite, which will eventually connect with another pathway, create a synapses to where we develop a whole new myelin sheath. And while we're doing that, this one is going to be pruned and basically just wither away. And that is essentially a plasticity of the brain. That's the brain experiencing change in plasticity. And so this is literally what we're doing with simple interventions. Simple classroom interventions that are not complex at all. When we start talking about them, many of you have probably already heard of. But we're actually going to help teachers understand the why behind their doing those interventions and understand the neurology that's going on with those interventions. So as we're talking about, and this is similar to what David Lewis was mentioning, just to re-emphasize, the kids, so we don't have the hypothalamus on here, so when our kids are experiencing anxiety or even like stimulus outside, their hypothalamus is taking in that sensory, their amygdala is reacting to it, the hippocampus is giving them that recent memory of whether or not they should be afraid of that or not. And often when this is happening, it's impeding their access to the prefrontal cortex, which is why David was saying the prefrontal cortex is not as developed with some of these kids because their brains are just hanging out in this region so often. Their experience is over here so much. If the amygdala is heightened and developed quicker, or is fully developed, and development is kind of exaggerated because of stress, they don't access the hippocampus as easily. That's all your recent memory. So a lot of our kids are experiencing an atrophy of recent memory. Principals, you are too.
And teachers.
And teachers.
They get overloaded with stress.
I did a study, and it clearly indicated principals are overworked, stressed out, and experiencing some unhealthy lifestyles, which is why we get out of the work.
That's why we're here to help you.
Speak to this this idea of when we look at the symptoms, so memory, problems with memory, it's one of the symptoms on both ADHD and complex trauma. And when you compare the symptom list of ADHD, ADD with complex trauma, very, very similar. And that's just an awareness that this work has brought me to, and just really thinking about how are we assessing my students.
And meeting their needs, because as we all know, that when kids get identified with ADHD, what typically happens? Put on meds, right? So that
You get on a stimulant.
right, and so that may help them focus in school. It might also create dependency on stimulants. But if what the kid is experiencing is regular exposure to toxic stress, and we're not actually helping them learn those new neurological pathways, we have different options than just giving medication. And we're not putting anyone down who's utilized medication and not saying it isn't helpful for some kids, but we all know in education that it's been a frequent go-to. Often I think because we're not sure what else can we do to help this kid that's really struggling to stay regulated.
And not just with our model, but even the RTI model, when being used properly, there's tons of research on the RTI model that indicate that false positives are cleaned up. So that 5% at the top, that should be your tier 3, which should be the IEP world. It should, nationally, we're about 15%. Based off significant research on RTI models, they were across all schools, they got it down to 5%. So there are plenty of simple tier 2 interventions that we can do to clear up what looks like ADHD versus saying, kids got ADHD, let's get them on a stimulant.
Let's keep going. Did you want me to speak to
Keep
that?
going.
Yeah. Oh yeah, no, I was skipping the brain piece. But really quickly, this is a nice visual to think about those kids that are in toxic environments versus the kids that have a pretty safe and stable home situation. And so what we know is that for the kids that have a healthy stress baseline, they come in every day and they're ready to learn. Whereas the kid that maybe slept in a car last night, is worried about a parent getting deported, is worried about a parent that started using again, or is incarcerated, or worried because found out parents getting divorced and there's been abuse in the home. Whatever that looks like, that child's baseline is much higher. And these are the kids for whom it seems like a simple trigger, like, oh, do you have your homework today? Or can you two sit together and be partners? And all of a sudden, Philippa, right, is like, no, F this, and blows out, and you're, whoa, where did that come from? Well, yes, exactly. Thank you for being my example. And you went first today. I owe you a chocolate. That'll relieve some of it. Yes, I have some with coffee. So we know that if we can put these regular practices in place, that we can help Philippa when she gets to school and experiences this safe environment, and where she's encouraged to breathe when she gets frustrated, she's learning those strategies to self-regulate, self-soothe. We can help her get out of the red zone so that she is in her prefrontal cortex and she's ready to learn.
Structure protective factors that are consistent. So the tier 1 approach that I was Smokey being the example, there's Funky Beard.
We spoke about this a little bit, but this is from an article that we shared with schools recently. But just it combines a lot of research around what are restorative practice and helps us take stock of restorative practices that can be used in schools. And so, as we mentioned, we'll be supporting you in thinking through those different layers. A lot of which, I'm kind of coining this phrase of pre-restorative practices, but knowing that if you have regular classroom meetings, for example, that's a huge opportunity. You're teaching kids how to solve problems with each other. They're getting language of how they engage with each other around different social and emotional issues. You're sitting in a circle so everyone can make eye contact. That's a practice that we would say is going to help you with restorative, because if your classroom community is accustomed to solving problems like that on a regular basis, now when there's a serious issue, there's some skills and strategies in place to actually address those issues. Those are the kinds of things we're going to help you think about as a school community, alongside other kinds of restorative options. Really quickly, we're big proponents of self-care. We always encourage staff to think about self-care, and especially you all leaders that, as Chris mentioned, typically are overrun. So think about self-care and practice self-care, and we'll help you as a school think about what are some rituals or routines within your staff culture that encourage well-being and self-care. So shifting gears a little bit to talk about the model, and then we'll invite Kathy and Cheryl to share more here in a moment. But we will encourage you to have a leadership team for Tier 1 in our year working together. Several schools already had what they were calling a PBIS Tier 1 team or another kind of leadership team that they've morphed into this. Some schools are actually calling it the Tilt. We care less about what you call it and more that it's a team that can meet with us on a regular basis and that's interdisciplinary and represents your grade levels or your departments if you're in the secondary. And many of you in the room who are counselors and psychs would often be a part of those teams. But that's really the main driver of the work, is this team that knows your school and knows your students and can help analyze data and make decisions together about the interventions that we're helping you put in place. This is a long list of what we hope will come out of the work. So can everyone read that text? Not in the back? Okay. Chris, you want to help me? We'll just read these real quick.
Yeah. So, the intended outcomes is, of course, reduction of ODRs, office disciplinary referrals, increased student attendance. We know nationally, Washington State, did anybody see this data come out recently? Washington State has the second worst attendance rate, highest. So that's obviously one. That seems like a Tier 1 for the state.
Yeah.
So we're going to try to. We want to emphasize that within your school districts. Student sense of belonging was one of the biggest factors we want to focus on. Does anybody have an idea what the biggest indicator of resilience is? What is it?
It's having a supportive person.
Supportive adult outside your home. Yep. And so that can be connection with the teacher. That can be connection with one of the coaches. One adult outside your home. Often you hear that people saying, "Oh, my dad was an alcoholic and my mom was barely home and I turned out fine." Well, really what the research indicates is these individuals, there was somebody outside their community or outside the family that actually helped guide them. We want to make sure that, so social emotional learning, again, ideally that's not just through a school counselor, that is with the teacher as well. They're co-teaching. Ideally, it can be actually sustainable with just teachers using it once they become familiar enough with it. Increased staff success in the classroom.
With management, I can keep going with classroom management and relationships with and between students. So teachers feeling a stronger sense of efficacy in terms of teaching those social skills and relational skills and seeing in classroom environments that kids are having more healthy and productive relationships amongst each other to focus on the learning. Increased academic performance, we know from implementing this model in other schools and from the research that when we really focus on these other more sort of affective elements of the educational setting, that reading and math performance increases.
We know that based off simple Tier 1 interventions of 5 to 1 in positive grade to door, the outcomes are actually increased academic engagement. So decreased behavior, increased academic engagement. Both studies also looked at teachers' concern about the intervention. Big quotes on that. 5 to 1 is intervention, but yes, it is.
What he means when he says 5 to 1?
5 positive comments to 1 negative or neutral. The question also within our research was, is this easy to implement as a teacher? And the answer came across as yes as well.
And then overall strengthening the school response and proactive systems for sustainable trauma-informed practice. So that's what we hope to accomplish in supporting the schools. And then long term, what we're so excited about for Snohomish County,
So and one of the things that we often ask is, why isn't mental health taught in health class? I mean, we all went to health class at some point, but we learned how our heart works, we learned our digestive system, we even got sex ed, but for some reason we didn't get mental health. Good demystifying that, getting rid of the idea that the brain or the mind is this kind of metaphysical box on our shoulders that we don't talk about. We want to connect that so that everybody understands when I experience anxiety, what's happening neurologically, what's happening, what can I do to cool down? What are some, if I'm depressed, what are some healthy strategies I can use versus hitting the bottle and drinking all night? And so we're hoping, we know that if we increase this, we're hoping that this is the outcome. And, decrease of alcoholism, decrease in domestic violence, decrease of suicide. Snohomish County, Tier 1 approach should be right now, suicidology. Snohomish County has the highest suicide rate in our state. So that should be Tier 1.
So thinking about schools taking on this idea of demystifying anxiety and depression and being able to talk about anxiety and depression and being able to put practices in place where we all can decrease anxiety and depression, what we hope for that is that kids walk out of school with more skills to face their lives and less likely to engage in those things. Did you want to make a comment about that? Go ahead. Yeah.
I wanted to know your take on the PEACE curriculum.
PEACE curriculum? Oh, we're not familiar. Is it a social emotional curriculum?
It's a spin-off of the anger replacement therapy.
Okay.
It's actually in the juvenile, but it is a positive behavioral curriculum that is actually, are you familiar with that?
No, I'm familiar with ART though.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is the curriculum brought to the student level and allowed to be in the school as full-time curriculum. I just wanted your take.
So I wonder if, so ART primarily was focused with kids in the juvenile justice system. So they probably brought that over to schools. I'm curious if they actually did a study prior to bringing it into schools. Like I was just mentioning restorative justice.
Okay.
Restorative justice is used in the juvenile justice system. Schools try to jump on that, and our point is, wait a minute, you need to make sure there's research on this population as well before you start implementing it. So I don't know if it did, but I would like to look at, it's called PEACE?
Yes.
PEACE curriculum?
Yes.
Okay.
It's about 10,000 to bring in, and they have pull-outs or full-time.
Okay.
It's just
Okay, interesting.
Definitely
We'll
look that up.
Yep.
Thank you.
So I'm looking at the clock, and I want to talk quickly. This is our team. So there's 3 of us here today, but we also have David, who you saw in the video, and then we have 3 other team members. Kelsey Schmitz, who works for OSPI, has significant PBIS and MTSS background. Our MTSS PBIS person is nodding, so you've met Kelsey, I imagine. And then we have Chris Pronis, we're calling him our principal in residence, but he's working at a school in Seattle where they've gone really deep around this work. They do assemblies every morning and teach breathing exercises, and so he's sort of our practitioner helping us with the work.
Yeah, his best school year start.
This fall, he's
pretty excited.
He's pretty excited about his staff and his readiness and his school this year.
He used our professional development training for his school, and he's very excited right now.
It's Highland Park Elementary in West Seattle. And then Brianne Roki is a psychologist, has a lot of experience with different kinds of programs like what we're implementing, and can be available to your school on an as-needed basis. And so Vincent, Chris, and David and I will be leads with schools, and then we will call upon the expertise of our other team members based on what we see and in conversations with your tilts if there's specific areas of going deep that their expertise would help benefit. And so our goal is to create a sustainable model that's evidence-based and a framework that you can utilize once we're no longer supporting you, and that's part of the vision of building your tilts capacity, is that we want leadership to not just fall on the shoulders of principals and assistant principals, but really delegating that and having shared understanding so that if you leave, this is what happens in education. What happens typically when someone leaves and a program that they've led, it often falls to the wayside. And so we want to avoid that. We really want to help you and your staff take on this shared understanding so that the work is sustainable. Really quickly, and I said this earlier, you can go to the next slide, but we're not using one-size-fits-all theory or approach. We want to make this specific. I also said this earlier that there will be schools that we can quickly get into Tier 2, but a lot of schools will probably focus more intensively on Tier 1 and start to get into Tier 2 and 3 over the course of the 2-year partnership. So really quickly, you can keep going just for the interest of time. If you want to look more deeply at these slides, you all have access to them now electronically. But if you join in the project, what you can anticipate is that we will, if we can establish this before January, we will. But we want to ensure that in January and February we meet with you and your leadership team, principals, that's your decision. Sometimes when we first sit down with the principal, it's just them. Sometimes it's them and the rest of their administrative team. Sometimes it's them and their entire Tier 1 team. So that's a decision that principals make in starting this work, and who's the initial conversation with. And from there, then we will do a pretty structured observation, about 2 or 3 hours we spend with a team. So we get across multiple classrooms. We don't go in the same classrooms together. We sit down and then we cull all of that information. And we give feedback back to you and your TILF or your leadership team based around all of those Tier 1 practices we showed you earlier in the pie chart. So this is the evidence we saw in your school of culturally responsive practice. This is the evidence we saw in your school of teaching common expectations. And then together with the TILF, we make some decisions about, okay, so we're about to train your staff. What should we focus on? How should we focus this to really tailor it to your school? And then after we've done that, this is kind of a broad scope, but starting in the spring of this coming school year then, ideally, we would get some time with your entire staff. We understand you all have collective bargaining agreements that only dictate so much staff time. So we're very willing to be creative about when and how. But ideally, we get ahead of that and start talking to your staff this spring about a lot of the information we've gone quickly over today. And continuing to support with your TILF, looking at data to start to design interventions together for your school. And so that sort of cycle of meeting on essentially a monthly basis with your leadership team and then getting in front of your staff ideally about 3 times a year, that's what the cycles look like for the 2-year project. You can go to the next slide. If moving into 2019 your school is ready to take on tiers 2 and 3, then we would shift and really start to work with, maybe you call it an SST or an MDT or a student of concern team, whatever tier 2 has looked like in your school in the past, working closely with that team and talking about how do we match the right interventions to the right kids. So we have tools for doing that, and then helping you design those more specialized interventions and measure them. Really quickly, there's a link here to, when you look at the slides, you can look at, we don't need to click on it. You have available to you. This is, so Panorama, are you guys all familiar with Panorama? No? So they are out of Massachusetts, and they have developed social emotional measures that Kathy can speak to a little bit. She's used them so far at Cascade High School, and they're going to go further this year. What's really unique about these measures is that we get student perception data on things like, do I feel a sense of belonging? Am I being taught how to solve problems with my peers?
Is there an adult I identify with?
Yeah. Do I feel like I'm safe with adults in the school? And so this is really powerful data to drive this work. There is some cost involved with Panorama, and so if you get in the project and you're interested, we have relationships with Panorama where we're currently still trying to finalize the Granite Falls.
We don't get a kickback.
We don't get a kickback, but we've helped Panorama now land in several districts.
They love us. We don't get anything out of it.
Because we think it's a really powerful source of information. If it's not feasible financially for your school, there are ways for us to think outside the box to still try to gather that student perception data. But I want to turn it over actually to both of our principals to share a little bit. And speaking of Panorama, or however you want to open, but Kathy, will you just share a little bit about your experience so far?
Sure. Hi. So at Cascade, we've actually been on this journey for a little while, and have been, I guess there's been a significant focus on equity issues in our school, so we've done things around discipline, disproportionality, about getting, we've done, worked with another organization, AP, Equal Opportunity Schools, to ensure that our AP and advanced placement classes are, the demographics of those classes will look like the demographics of our school, which 5 years ago they did not, and now they do. We've essentially eliminated that access gap. We have worked on with discipline disproportionality. We have very close to eliminated the gap with race, where we're still seeing a lot of disproportionality is with special education. And so our staff has been very interested in working on trauma-informed practices, and I had some support staff that was really planting some seeds for about a year, and then a year ago this fall, Joe Nigel came out and actually presented on trauma-informed practices to our entire staff. And we watched the film Paper Tigers in the reverse order. And the staff became very interested, how do we implement this in our school, which is different from a very small alternative high school, and, you know, what maybe some of the problematic practices in that film that were shown, because we want to be able to implement it. And really, they were kind of understanding, at the same time, we've been just in the beginning stages of implementing PBIS. And so they were understanding the 3 tiers, and that we really are focused, most of them were understanding that we're really focused on tier 1 and the universal. So after we had Joe come out and speak, the county had a trauma-informed practices conference, workshop, and I asked staff who would like to go, and 19 of my staff said, I want to go. I was, well, 30 of my staff said I want to go. I couldn't get that many subs, so 19 of my staff went. And some of the staff that went are now, and I've specifically selected them for my TILT team because they were skeptics before. And after those 2 experiences, they were like, no, I get this. This is not about not holding kids accountable. I have a couple of staff members that need to go. Not there yet. But these were staff members that said, no, I understand. This is not about not holding kids accountable. This is about holding them accountable within community and building relationships and seeing things differently. And so I have specifically put those people who have the ear of other skeptics. So they're on my team as well as some others who've always been on board and excited about this. So then last year, we also had the opportunity to pilot Panorama Education Survey, the social emotional learning survey with our students. And we did it once early in the year, once later in the year, and did the same group of students. We didn't do all of our student population. We did actually freshmen and seniors because that's where the social emotional curriculum was being implemented. So we did that, and what we found is some really great things, like students really had a high growth mindset, and they had really some positive things. And 2 areas where our staff believed we were doing a really good job were very low. And one was in the sense of belonging, and one was with student-teacher connection. And this, for one of the first times ever, I think staff looked at data, and I didn't hear the survey must be wrong. And I didn't hear that. I heard we need to do something different. And people got really reflective. And right at that time, the grant came open. Like, oh, this is really working out very nice. And I guess that was after we did the first one. And then the second one, it really confirmed for staff that this is something that we need to do. So it all fell together very nicely, but it's been years in building them. And so the TILT team met last spring, and the Continua group came out and did a baseline survey and found what you would expect to find in a high school that is in the 1.5 years into implementing PBIS, that there were pockets doing it really well, and pockets where it wasn't evident at all. And a lot of what I find is it's my experienced, highly competent teachers that aren't doing it because they didn't understand that while this works for me in my classroom, it's not working for the kid as they transition from classroom to classroom, or all of those sorts of things. So, the TILT team met with Courtney and Chris last spring, and then again this fall, or this summer right before school started, to kind of like what should the professional development look like for our staff. We scheduled monthly meetings and 3 times per whole staff development, and then actually it was Courtney and David who came out and presented and worked with our staff the week before school started, and I haven't had a chance to talk to them about it. So this is our 3rd day of school, so this week it's hard to be gone.
Thanks for being here.
But they, so we just said, and I just said, and I've been saying this for years, but it's like, no, everyone is going to do positive reading at the door every period, no matter what. This is what you're doing. So administrators were out in buildings and we're checking. And almost all our teachers are, and we're talking to teachers who aren't and saying, oh, this is important. But they, I think Vincent said, they understand the reason why. oh, it's not just. And so, seeing some of these kinds of things about stress, and I'm hearing really positive things from our staff. We did really our 2 days of professional development, one of my staff members said. So the messages were supposed to build community. There you go. So she was being a little sarcastic. She was totally on board. But we've been walking around, and our staff members are, while there's doing curriculum, I've asked them, will you hold off doing rules for a couple of days? Kids are pretty excited about being in school, and so let's do things to build community and make sure the kids know each other and they feel safe. And the teachers really understand that students need to have connection. They need to feel a sense of belonging in school. So those two low areas in that panorama survey are where build a connection with teachers, student, and a sense of belongingness in the school. So they're very focused on that, and staff is more excited about that, and seeing that happen. And even some of my skeptical staff members about, I don't do touchy-feely stuff, we gotta get right into it, they're doing it and liking it. And so then we will, Monday is the day when we're doing specific PBIS lessons throughout the day, system-wide, and then they will co-construct norms in that classroom based on our PBIS matrix. So far, it's going well, but we have a plan to sustain it. And one of the best things about this is it isn't somebody coming in and doing something and then going away. It's like this is sustainable and long term. And as I was saying before, it's not something else. It kind of holds together what we're doing. So it's not something on top of. Sometimes it's a little hard to convince staff of that, but it really is part of our school improvement plan. If you look at the objectives for this, it's like increased attendance. That's an imperative, right? And decreased discipline and all of those sorts of things. And then we're also really focused on closing equity gaps. So we're really excited about it. I'm a cheerleader. And then we are continuing to use Panorama, and we'll be going into that deeper using it with all of our students. And then we're actually going to be tying it to individual students and their data with attendance and grades and discipline and all of those sorts of things, which is a little bit trickier. But so I'm excited about the work.
Thank you. Sounds like we're done there.
No, because, everybody's excited in September, March, in May.
I'm hiding back here. So my name is Cheryl Larson. I'm principal at Mountain Elementary in Granite Falls. We are a K-2 school, so on the other end of the spectrum. This is our second year as a K-2, so we kind of had a few triggers that launched this work for us. Around the time that we were told we were going to reconfigure from 2 K-5 elementary schools into a primary and intermediate, was the time we were becoming aware of discipline laws that had changed around student time in classrooms, and we had a really traditional approach to discipline previously, progressive discipline, and years of data to support, but it wasn't working for us. Same kind of offenses, the numbers were just sad to look at. No changes from year to year. So with the momentum of that reconfiguration, we decided, look, this is a really great opportunity for us to try to become preventionists instead of interventionists and to really build a system. So we started learning, kind of doing self-teach about restorative practices, and it's really hard at the elementary level to find resources. There's not a great research base. There's not a great wealth of resources out there. So it was like divine intervention when we heard about this grant, and knowing that there are experts out there that have information that they can share with us, and we don't have to try to do this work alone. All taxed, we're all maxed out every day, and so to have people that are willing to come in, see what we've got going, and help us build on the strengths was such a selling point. So we last year, working with restorative practices, we tried things on. It was pretty loose. It was a very different approach for teachers. And so I was careful as a principal not to try to prescribe too much. I wanted my staff to build what they were comfortable with. And in that comfort, there was a lot of discomfort. And so to have a formation of a tilt team, to have some resources and research, to have an outside perspective come in with Chris and Courtney and kind of look at what we had going, we were really able to build on that. And the staff was really ready to do that work and do it with research behind us. So we kind of were operating on that feeling piece. You know, we knew that this was good for our kids. It felt better than punishing them, but we didn't really know why. And so to have them bring in all of this brain research and the physiological change information, that even just naming ACEs and naming, that actually was the first time I'd seen all that, the toxic stress indicators in that video. I was like, holy cow, we gotta get that. But, you know, just connecting what we're doing with the research has been so powerful. And even just, you know, having them come in and they've seen so much more than I've seen in my building, just in my own little world. Somebody mentioned, I think it was Chris mentioned, hey, because we do line up in the morning, it was a disaster last year. Hey, not like a morning assembly. Oh, okay, so yesterday was our first morning assembly. We did breathing exercises with the kids. It was amazing. Kids left quiet, calm, ready for the day to start. Emphasis on you know, meeting our school-wide expectations and getting our brains and bodies ready to learn. And so it was really cool. So I hope that Josie did a good job this morning. So anyway, there's just been a lot of, the trajectory has been really quick for us. And so we're really excited to get into the Tier 2 work too, because one of the things that weighs really heavily on me is that we have almost no Tier 2 resources in my building or my district, and so what's happening is those 20% in Tier 2 and Tier 3, they're all Tier 3, because we don't have those Tier 2 resources. Kids go to special ed if they're in Tier 2, so it's really about developing for us that Tier 2 intervention work so that we can prevent more things. That's my big thing, for prevention piece for this. So that's where we're at. We're super happy to have them in our building, in our district, and I'm hoping that Tier 2 happens as fast as Tier 1.
Well, and speaking to that, I want to open it up for questions, but I think both schools, as you heard in their stories, have been doing a tremendous amount of work before meeting with us, and I think it's been really nice to help synthesize and give some of the rationale behind. At Cheryl's school, her tilt is very engaged, and they spent a lot of their summer thinking about how do we go universal on Tier 1. So they built common lessons for their colleagues around some of the agreements. They made agreements as a staff in the spring. Okay, we're all gonna have class meetings. We all want to try specific restorative practices. We all commit to this school-wide assembly, for example. But the teacher leaders have been really remarkable in saying, okay, my colleagues need some common ways to approach this. Here are some T-charts. Here's the common language. Here's what the lessons look like. And so they're really well situated to say, okay, we've agreed these things and we have a plan. And I think because of that they're in a very different place than other schools that are still figuring out what do we mean by Tier 1. So at Cheryl's school, we're going to be able to get to Tier 2 sooner. And that doesn't mean that the other schools aren't great schools. It's just that they're in different places, just like kids are in their classrooms. So thank you both for sharing that. We have a little bit of time left. We really just want to open it up for you guys to ask questions.
Liza.
Oh, Liza, go ahead.
Yeah, just quickly, I wanted to talk about next steps. So if you're a school that's interested in applying, the letter of intent is due on the 22nd of this month. So we're looking at readiness. It would have to be the letter of intent is signed by the principal, and the superintendent needs to sign off as well. We did a letter of intent this time instead of an RFP to really lower the barriers and make it easier. So it's pretty simple to do. And if you have any questions, you can feel free to call Amanda or myself, and we can talk about if you have any particular questions. But we have funding for 10 spots at this point.
In terms of ongoing funding to add more schools, we're not sure where that is. So I cannot guarantee there's going to be another cohort. So it's something to think about for your schools of whether you're ready. Again, it's a 2-year commitment, but again, I don't know if there's going to be funding after this. I can't guarantee that. So if you have any questions afterwards, Amanda and I will stay around. But thank you for everybody for coming.
Absolutely.
And we'll make sure everybody here and our distribution list gets the letter of intent instructions again, because they can get lost in email.
Yeah.
So we'll make sure everybody has that too.
So any questions for our principals, for us, for the group, before we want to end on time, because we know it's Friday, it's a busy day. But any questions, thoughts that you want to share before we wrap up?
Just thank you.
Thank you very much.
Absolutely.
All right.
Okay.
And
Yeah, go ahead. Vincent.
some quick language that I found is that MTSS doesn't tell you what to do. It helps you align your service delivery. And that to me is why it works, right? That's what it's doing, is aligning all your service delivery so that there really is a scope and sequence that makes sense to everyone. So,
And we did record this.
Yes.
So you all, I think everybody could send it to people.
Yes.
So we will send out the webinar as well. So if you have people in your school or people in your district who weren't able to make it, they can get the same information that you got today.
One other resource I want you guys to know about, on February 28th and March 1st, we're having a big resiliency conference at Xfinity Arena. Nadine Burke-Harris is going to be the keynote on the first day. For those of you who know it, she's all about ACEs and resiliency. It's going to be a lot of free CEUs. It's a free conference. It's a day-and-a-half conference. So we'll send out information. The link, there's 512 spots. So the link is going to go out in the next, probably within the next week. So if you have staff that are interested in going, pay attention to that, because it will fill fast. We filled our trauma-informed workshop up at Tulane Electronics last year really quickly. So I just wanted to let you guys know about this. So there's going to be a lot of workshops. I think we have 10 different workshops on suicide prevention and trauma-informed work and restorative practices and lots of preventative and interventions to use for your students. So just wanted you to be aware of this.
February 28th and March 1st.
And we put several of our business cards out on the tables. I also put our email addresses up here. Oops, well, that Liza just talked about that. But please feel free, if you're thinking about writing a letter of intent and you just have some more clarified questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us. And if you're thinking that getting in front of your staff 3 times a year is going to be a challenge, we don't want that to be a barrier, so we want to be thoughtful together. So please don't not apply because of that issue. We understand this is a flexible profession we're all in, so we want to make it work. All right. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you.
We'll take your playing cards back. You take them? Thank you.